We were funded by OWEB through a research grant starting in 2008, and our primary goal was to look at whether the recovery of tidal wetlands in Salmon River has benefited coho as well. So we wanted to look at juvenile habitat use and performance within the estuary, using residency or time that they spend in the estuary, growth during that time, as well as survival to adult. And then we wanted to look at the population response across that whole basin, considering life history, diversity, production, and resilience. So as you may know, there's a fairly conventional 3-year life cycle for coho salmon in Oregon, in which the fish spawn in the fall, early winter, from October through January, sometimes a little later. They spend a year and a half in streams and freshwater, migrate through the estuary briefly, out to the ocean for a year and a half and back. So it's a fairly fixed 3-year life cycle, with the exception of maybe 5% that come back as 2-year-old jacks. So our life history objectives were to identify juvenile migration time, size, age growth, residency, estimate the survival to adult, and the proportional contribution of each of those life history types if there's more than the one life history. And at the same time, evaluate whether or not estuary habitat is important to that productivity of the population. And with the pit antenna in the 96 wetland, we found that those fish were extensively using the 96 wetland. This scale is 0 to 50, and these are the unique fish that we saw going in and out of that wetland over a 4-month period. So they're using that whole area, and in fact, we had fish that were tagged at Crowley Creek. They showed up on the pit antenna. So they were using that whole estuary over the course of those months in there. It was a bit of a surprise. We did not, despite sampling every 2 weeks at the mouth, we did not catch any coho leaving the system. We would have expected a lot of those fall migrants would have just left the system, gone to the ocean early. But we did not. I take that back. I think we caught one over the course of 5 years of sampling in there. So basically, they're using the estuary. They're using some of the areas above where the culverts had been replaced. They're jumping up into these tributaries. And if we compare again to Bob Mullen's work, here's 1975 to 77 are the top 2 graphs. Here's a traditional yearling, which we see, of course, recently. But then the sub-yearlings Bob sampled up through beginning of December. You wouldn't see much, but here's what it looks like now with all the wetlands in there. So there's a place for those fish to be at this point. So those fish came down into the estuary, spent a few months, went back into freshwater, and then back to the estuary, and then out to the ocean. But our real question was, we could identify these in the estuary, but then did any of those estuary rearing life history types contribute back to the adult population? So again, we could use the combination of the pit tags for doing that, as well as, since the fish were already dead, we could remove the otoliths without any sense of guilt. Messy though. So what we saw basically was that in the black bar are the juvenile life histories we sampled again at the mouth as they went out. Yearlings were the most common ones that we sampled, about 80% or so. Fry migrants we could sample at the mouth and identify them through the otoliths, same with the nomads, and again with the par migrants. Then when they came back as adults, we both did the otolith work on the adult fish, but we also had the pit antenna at the hatchery so that we knew when those pit tagged fish came back. So if we tagged a fish in the estuary in November and it came back as an adult, we knew what its life history type was. And so for those, these show just the standard air across the years. The yearlings accounted for anywhere from 60 to 75% of the adults returning, whereas the whole suite of estuary rearing fish, particularly the par migrants, contributed at anywhere up to 30%, And I think the 2010 brood year, they contributed 60% of the returning adults. So and in 2012, they contributed maybe 5 to 10%. So you can see that rearing strategy has some benefits, and that some years it was wiser to spend your time in the estuary in the wintertime than in freshwater. But still, the freshwater group, the conventional still contributes 2/3 of what comes back, but that those estuary rearing fish are a substantial contribution, and in some years can be even more important. So when we look at the population response to the estuary restoration, looking at both coho and Chinook, they obviously benefited from those restored marsh habitats. When you look at how long they spend there, their feeding, how quickly they grow. And so that life history variation can recover. When you're presented the opportunity of those newly opened habitats, those fish will use it and gain from that. And if we look overall at the restored estuary life history with the Chinook, we saw anywhere up to 75% of those Chinook used anywhere from 30 to 120 days in the estuary. And about 30% of the coho adults were tied to that restoration as well. And the other is that we found these results are applicable across the region and has been used extensively. But again, it's always difficult to keep the funding stream continuing. And it would have been nice to have continued we finished up 2012 was the last year we sampled in the estuary. It was the 2011 brood year. But since 2012, 2013, we've then gone through El Niños, warm blobs, all of this other high populations, tiny populations, and it would have been really nice to have been in there sampling at this level of intensity through these really variable years. We'd have maybe a better understanding of how the population operates. So this is always, when you're in research, of course, you always say this, but it was a good example where about the time we ended is where the ocean really started going up and down. And so it does emphasize there's a need to keep some level of effort.